This is Valerie. She's my sister, and she likes to play video games, especially The Sims, and more Sims, and dancing while playing The Sims, and Psychonauts, and a bit more Sims. But despite how few games she's played, she is a hardcore gamer. It's how she likes to spend her time. So we're going to do an experiment. She's going to play through games in order of release to see just how much the video game industry has changed over the years. We are then going to see if the games that my generation hails as classics are actually as good as we thought they were. Valerie is about to set out on an adventure. She's going to play through history. Video games have been around a lot longer than you probably think they have. The very first development of this sort of interactive technology took place all the way back in 1947 with a machine called the cathode ray amusement device. This machine was incredibly limited in terms of its interactivity, but the player would take the role of a missile being fired at targets that stayed stationary on the screen. However, the technology was truly in its infancy and wouldn't see any kind of commercial release for nearly 3 decades later. It wasn't until 1961 when a group of MIT graduates developed a game called Space War, which really started video games' obsession with science fiction and fantasy. Again, Space War didn't make it into the hands of consumers. It was simply much too advanced of a machine for its time. However, it did set the standards of using a computer to propel interactive experiences. Up until then, everything else had been analog. But finally, in 1971, a game is released called Computer Space, and it is the very first arcade cabinet. However, it never quite reaches the success that its developers would have hoped for. 1972, however, brings along a game that will change the landscape of this industry forever. It's a game you've probably heard of. It's Pong. Pong goes on to be a phenomenal success, releasing a home version in 1975 that becomes all the craze, and that becomes really the very first video game console, even though you could only play one game on it. Now, if we wanted this show to be the most historically accurate and to really show the most influential games, Valerie should have played Pong first. That would have been very important. However, there's one problem. Pong isn't very entertaining to play by yourself, and it's even less entertaining to watch. So we decided to skip ahead, further into the history of the arcade. Atari's enormous success with Pong had a lot of companies wanting to ride its coattails, and they started producing clone copies of the exact same game. This led to the first big industry crash of 1977, where video games almost ceased to exist. We're going to pick up our story right after this collapse, when a game called Space Invaders came along to save the day. Space Invaders was so successful at its time that it sold almost 60,000 arcade cabinets in 1 year. There were entire storefronts in Japan designed to show off just this one game.
I thought Space Invaders was boring, mostly because of the pacing. It just felt really slow to me, and it was also really repetitive. I just felt like I was hitting the same buttons over and over and over again. Which I don't normally mind, but because the pacing was so slow, it didn't work for me. I felt like I just was going back and forth and then hitting the space button, whereas if I could have moved around a little bit more, that would have been nice.
It's difficult to pinpoint exactly why Space Invaders had such an enormous impact on popular culture, but the fact of the matter is it did, and it proved that video games were here to stay.
I think it's probably a classic because it was one of the first, so it was like a really big thing to happen in the gaming world.
Pong was not a one-trick pony. There was a lot more you could do with this new art form. Following Space Invaders out the gate in 1979 was Asteroids, a game that finally allowed the player to move in multiple directions. They could move up, down, left, and right. This was a new kind of freedom. Asteroids also used an art style that was a bit more aesthetically pleasing than its predecessor. With vector graphics, it could create neon colors that were bright and vibrant, drawing people to the screen. Tasked with blowing apart floating asteroids before they could hit you, the game actually used pretty advanced physics for the time. When you would hit one of the rocky substances, it would explode into multiple smaller rocks. This led to a complexity that you really didn't see in the previous games, and I think this is a huge part of Asteroids' success. Eventually, they beat Space Invaders' record, selling over 70,000 arcade consoles to stores throughout the US and the world.
No! I saw a lot of progress between Space Invaders and Asteroids because of the moving, like, being able to move around so much. I did like that all the asteroids became smaller and smaller. I thought that was an interesting thing. And it made it a little more difficult because you could still be hit with the same asteroid, even though it got tinier. I've still seen versions of things like Asteroids around, so I think it could still hold up in an arcade setting. I've seen it a lot online and on mobile phones, because when people get bored, it's a fun game to play.
But video games had more to offer the world than celestial dogfights, and in 1979, Atari released their very first home console, the 2600. One of the first games to find huge success on the 2600 was Adventure, the very first action-adventure game. This was an incredibly ambitious project for its time. It featured what is akin to an open world, a maze in which the player could explore any direction. However, if they went too far, they might run into an evil dragon.
Ah! The dragon was frustrating! I don't know what the dragon was for. I don't even think it killed me. I don't know what was going on, but I just stopped working because of the dragon. And then later, when the dragon tried to attack me, it didn't do that. So I don't know what was going on with that dragon. Adventure was the most confusing thing I've ever seen in my entire life. I had no idea what I was doing the entire time.
So where do I take the key? I'm really confused. Nothing's happening! What is the purpose? Is there a purpose to this game? Oh!
I know there was a key, and I didn't know what I was supposed to do with it. And then there was this dragon that attacked me, and I couldn't move. I didn't know what was going on. I could see why Adventure would be appealing at that point in time, because you do get to move around, and that's pretty cool.
Do you think?
It felt really confusing to me because I didn't know where I was going, and if I knew where I was going, then maybe I would have had a little more fun.
This sense of openness and exploration has been hugely influential on just about every genre of video game. Since the release of Adventure, games have gotten a lot more creative and detailed in their world building. But that doesn't mean this was not incredibly inspiring to the people who played it. This was the first time you really felt the wonder and awe of exploration, and it really helped to show a lot of young game designers the possibilities of this art form. By 1980, the video game industry was truly flourishing, and designers began taking chances that they wouldn't have otherwise. Battlezone is a great example of the kinds of risks that people were taking at the time. It's the first time that a game tries to approximate three-dimensional space, and while the graphics appear to be pretty minimalistic by today's standards, it was very advanced for the time. It has the look and feel of a modern first-person shooter, albeit with neon straight lines on a screen. But just by looking at the lineup of today's AAA studios and seeing how many FPSs there are out there, you can really get a feel for just how influential Battlezone was at its time, and even still today.
Playing Battlezone what didn't feel too different for me in a game like Space Invader, because it felt pretty similar to Space Invader, but it felt pretty different from Asteroids or Adventure, because it was just like you moving around one way or the other, and then pressing the space bar. So in that respect, it didn't feel that different. But it was cool getting to like have a 360 kind of view of things. Even though I found myself only using like the first one, like more like doing a 180 than 360. It definitely felt influential to first-person shooter games. I only care about having fun. It doesn't really matter whether it's 3D or 2D. So in that aspect, I had more fun with Asteroids and even Adventure because I got to move around and I wasn't just going one way or the other. Where it still felt like in that game, I was still only going one place or the other. Well, I could go forward. But even when I was going forward, it didn't feel like I was going anywhere.
To truly cement the legacy of the arcade, the video game industry needed a blockbuster hit, something equivalent to a giant movie that it could point to say, this is why we're here to stay. Pac-Man was that blockbuster. Released towards the end of 1980, Pac-Man became synonymous with gaming. He became a pop cultural phenomenon that no one could have expected. By the end of the 80s, the arcade cabinet had grossed over $1 billion, which is more than Star Wars made during the same time period. This shows you just how successful this game was for Namco, and why the character of Pac-Man has become as iconic as Mario or Lara Croft or any of the other characters you think of when you think of video games.
I really enjoy Pac-Man. I think it's really fun. I don't know why it's fun. It just is getting to run around with a little yellow Pac-Man guy chasing after little dots. It's just fun. I don't know what it is. It's just fun. I think repetition can be done well because I think the difference between Pac-Man and Space Invaders was Pac-Man was had fast pacing and you were running around and there was also you still never knew where the guys, the little alien guys were coming. What are they called?
They're ghosts.
Yeah, there's some definite shades of adventure in there, but I think adventure, you don't really know what your goal is, whereas there's a clear goal with Pac-Man.
But why was this game such an enormous hit?
Compared to the other games, Pac-Man's a lot more colorful. That's for one. It's got some color in it, which is different from the other games, and I think it takes aspects from each of those games and kind of puts them together.
Game designers had been working for just over half a decade on this technology, and they were finally starting to understand what pressed players' buttons, what would make them continue to want to put quarters into the machine and to continue playing. Pac-Man takes everything that was learned during this time period and puts it into one package, a colorful, bright package that's very appealing to the eyes and gives the players rewards for continuing on through the game. They actually get little mini cutscenes if they manage to complete certain stages. By this time, arcades began popping up all around the United States, and kids and adults alike began using them as social gathering places. Simultaneously, the Atari 2600 was bringing the experience of the arcade right into your home, right onto your television, and that was a huge deal. The games industry was making a lot of money, and they were making even more great games. And in the next installment, we're going to continue to explore the arcade scene of the early 80s, and then get to the crash of 1983. But for now, we want to know, what is your favorite classic arcade game? What game do you think has to be included on the next episode's list for it to truly encompass the most influential games of the time period? Why do you like that game? We really want to know, and if you comment in the section down below, we might include your comments in the next episode, so please try and do that for us.
Don't forget to check out jetpackjoust.com, like, share, and subscribe to the channel, and have a magic day!